and it's right beside it.
Got it. It was just 4 windows buried.
Okay. Well, welcome everyone. This is a new edition of Ubitalks. If this is the first time you're with us, basically every Thursday we have a special guest that's either talking about career or tech or careers in tech. And we just have really good people in North America, South America exchanging notes. This week we have a special guest that is Brian. So he's CTO at Paper. And he's going to tell us a little bit about how he's been transitioning the product from Monolith and kind of how he learned, what mistakes he was able to avoid, how he was able to keep the team engaged and learning and having a bit more visibility of how assertive they were being. And, you know, Brian, you're much better than me, so go ahead, introduce yourself and share your wisdom.
Sure. Yeah. So I'll give a quick intro first and kind of dive into the agenda. So I'm Senior Vice President, not CTO, but close. Senior Vice President of Technology here at Paper. Been in software for a long time, over 20 years, and been in EdTech for about 7 years now. Worked with a lot of different companies as they have evolved from startup phases into larger engineering teams. And in the evolution of that process, architecture, data focus, and culture. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about the journey we had at Paper and some of the challenges many startups see. Typically, a startup starts with a pretty simple architecture, going simple because they have a small team, it's monolithic, and they're simplifying everything around their business intelligence and how they share data with the business. As they grow and scale, they need to adjust. And that progression as you grow is rather a complex challenge. So I'll talk a little bit about how we did it at Paper and how we incorporated both the transition into a more mature architecture and into a model where we're better supporting data to the business in one go. So I'm going to start off by showing a really simple picture. For some of the non-technical people in the audience, this will be a little bit deep for y'all, but we keep it pretty high level. So for software developers, this should look pretty familiar. This is a standard starting architecture for a new product. You've got a database, you've got one code base that has all of your business logic in it, and you've got a couple of front ends for it, a web interface and a mobile interface. Usually at this time, you've got a pretty small development team, 5, 10 people. And really 3 code bases at most that they're working in. So it's very manageable. The team's able to be efficient at building out the system, working within this code base. Usually for smaller startups, there's also a need from the business to understand data that's happening. So for an EdTech, for example, how many activities are occurring on the platform, or what is feedback about those activities? And at this stage, typically there's somebody that's both a little bit focused on the business, but technical enough that they're able to go in and query the raw database, the production database. They're able to write SQL queries and be able to say, I'm looking for this information, I'm going to share it with the leadership team. As the company starts to grow, though, you start to see more and more challenges with this. So first thing is your database starts to grow large. And your business analyst is querying that. As the database grows large, you can start introducing bad queries. You're really pointing to a production database, and you can have conflicting goals where effectively the business analyst is running queries that's taking down the system. The other challenge that you hit pretty quickly is that you start to expand your team. You go from 5 developers to 20 to 40, and you have all these developers that are working within a very small number of code bases. Typically, as you expand your dev team, you're really wanting the throughput, the output of what you're delivering to be growing linear. You've got 8 people or double in size, you want to double the throughput. But with that architecture that you started with, you're really not. You're going to start to see diminishing returns. That's really because you have so many people working on one code base, the cognitive load that needs to be there for every engineer becomes high. You start getting a lot of dependencies between developers. You have a lack of clear coordination in areas of ownership of different individuals within the team. So typically what the team that does then is move towards microservices. Microservices has been a big buzzword for almost 10 years now. When it first came out, there was very much oh, this is the savior. It's going to solve all of our problems. We're going to take one big code base, smash in a bunch of little ones, break up teams, so each owns their own. Kind of circling back to this picture, what does that look like? Basically, ideal state looks something like this. Now I've got my front end, my user interface. It's got a couple of developers working on it. And now I've got a set of different services in the back end. Each with their own set of developers. The cognitive load is much lighter. They're able to manage the code base themselves. However, it's really more complicated than that. As you really get into this, there are quite a few challenges. Really, the first one is, as you're thinking about these services, what happens when one of the services relies on data for the other? In this picture, was all the interface, the user interface talking directly to the services, but really so often service A may need data from service B. Well, what people often are tempted to do is kind of cheat. So from an architectural perspective, this is an anti-pattern, something bad, where you have two different services reading from the same data store. It's an easy thing to do. It's something that many teams often do early on because it's quick, but you pay for it in the long run. You end up in a state where it slows down development velocity because you have to coordinate changes across those teams again. And all the challenges that you had within the monolith with multiple teams, you start to bring back into this service model. So what's better? Well, this looks better, right? Now you're actually having the services talk to each other through APIs that are standard. This is the common next step of like, all right, now I'm going to start using well-known APIs. But unfortunately, as things grow, it often turns into something more like this, where every service is calling every other service, and it really becomes a bit more of a mess. In an architecture like this, you start seeing higher latency. For example, if the user interface is calling service A, and that calls service B, and that calls service C, then every one of those calls is introducing latency. So it's going to worsen the user experience. It's going to be slower. You lose resiliency. If one of those services is down, then likely all of them are down. You don't have a scenario where features A might not be working, but the rest of the platform is. Here, if one goes down, likely they all go down. You still circle back into that kind of cognitive load as each service needs to know more about the others. And so you're still not getting that, that reduced cognitive load that we set as a goal with the service-oriented architecture of microservices. And then last, even some of the accountability of those teams goes down. So the team working on service A doesn't really feel fully in control. If part of their features are slow, it may be because service C that's owned by a different team is running poorly. And so they don't feel that sense of ownership and ability to meet the expectations of the business. Last, if we circle back to our business analyst, in that early architecture, they were able to run queries directly on one database. Now that we've gone to the service-oriented architecture, we now have several databases that they are querying and thinking about, oftentimes looking to join data between them. They're trying to get maybe user information out of the first service to tie it to activities in the second service, and they don't really have a good way to put all that data together in a sense that's coherent for the business. So, what has been our evolution at Paper? Back to the first slide, we started and it looked mostly like this. We had separate interfaces for our mobile app, for our web app, and a core API in the middle that was talking to one database. What we did was, instead of starting with services, we really started with moving towards an event model. Part of this is really driven by the fact that we already were caring about data at that time and data that wasn't captured in our database. An example is student rostering data. So we're EdTech, we care about what students are enrolled in what sections for what term, but the application only cared about the current semester. So this database here at the bottom only contained the latest data. And the business wanted to be able to see 3 years ago, 4 semesters ago, who was enrolled in what sections. So we already had a need to start tracking not just data that's within the database, but the historical representation of that data. So it immediately made sense for us to drive towards an event model where we were starting to push and create events for everything that happened in the system. A student was enrolled in a course, a student performed an activity, a student did this, pushing it on an event bus architecture that would go into a data lake. For us, we're hosted at GCP, so that meant using PubSub and writing into BigQuery there. If you're at AWS, that could be Kinesis or their event bus and S3. But there's tons of architectures to support this. But the key here is that we started not by breaking apart the monolith, but we started by let's publish events and leverage those events to set ourselves up for service-oriented in the future and to expose that data. This then let us have a business analyst that was somewhat technical, have a single place they could go query and get access to that data. So instead of running queries against our production database that could start causing performance problems, could suffer as we go to service-oriented, they had one source of truth that they were working at. Still required somebody pretty technical because they're writing SQL statements, but they have one place to go for it. So next, we were able to start layering in services. So once we had this event model in place, we started carving out different services that we could leverage. At this point, they all followed the same model. Took the approach that everything that happened, we would publish an event for it. If we would stand up a new activity that students could perform, we wanted events to be published for everything the student did in that activity. So we had that data, the business could understand the impact of it, we can measure it and move forward. We started with that model and we're able to easily kind of rubber stamp these up. As we did this, one of the things to highlight is that, all of these steps take time. There's a lot of time at getting that first service in place, a lot of work to make sure you have the right patterns in place, to make sure you have the right quality gates, automation in place so that you can quickly deploy, so that you can quickly build new ones. It takes time. The one thing to remember as you're doing this is to take it iteratively, move slowly, service by service, and kind of progression as we go. But as you do this, you start with this event model that then lets you scale out more broadly, more quickly. One of the challenges I had talked about with service-oriented in general and microservices is when services rely on data from others. Well, once this event model is in place, what we're able to do is rely on that asynchronous events to be able to feed data in different places. So for example, if a service cares about what student activities have been performed, and maybe it's keeping counts of that, we're able to subscribe to the same event bus that's feeding data into the data lake and capture that there. That keeps us from having that tight coupling and synchronous model that was described as challenging before. On the BI side, at this point, we really started to mature our approach there. So we had all this data that was giving us information in the system, but we still had business analysts that had to be very technical. So really the next step is bringing in data engineering into the mix, who's able to take that raw data. The data in your data lake is not going to be structured in a way that's the easiest for the types of queries that the business wants to run. It's not modeled for that. It's really just raw data. Having them work on transformations of that, modeling it into the right format that then an analytics team can perform and analyze. And then they can really even start exposing reports, views, notifications to leadership team, right? You have this in place, and then you're starting to automate all of the business intelligence going to the company. Another key piece of this, as we think about the data side, is there's a lot that you don't want to build yourself. Once we got this data pipeline in place, it was tempting for us to try and use it for everything. Kind of if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. There's a lot of events and a lot of information that happens on the client side. Somebody viewed a page, somebody clicked a button on the client, somebody landed here. There's no need to route that through server-side event architecture. There are a ton of great third-party tools like Pendo, Google Analytics, and so forth that are optimized for capturing that data. Our temptation when we first started, when we said this other framework, was to use it for everything. But really, we had already Pendo in place that we're able to leverage for a lot of the data there. And it was simply a matter of using third-party tools, third-party ETL tools to augment our data in the data lake and data warehouse with that data. In addition, a lot of our customer data lives in third-party systems within Salesforce. Other places will be different CRMs, but that data is there. There's sometimes a temptation of like, all right, I'm going to put that data into the product database too, when really there's no need. It should only go into the production databases if that data is needed to serve the end user. So with this, all these pieces in place, it becomes much easier for us to actually start doing A/B testing. We then are able to leverage feature flag services like Launch Darkly so that we can selectively turn on features for different users and have control and test groups. Those services can be configured to say, all right, for the school or the set of users where we want to try out something, let's turn it on for them, not turn it on for others. We've got the full data pipeline in place that's able to send what the user's doing into our data lake. So we have the analysis there. But then also, because we've leveraged an ETL tooling, we can up here get that third-party data, the feature flag data to know what's who's in group A and who's in group B into our data lake as well. So I have this picture. It's all kind of generic service A, service B, but mentioned in the description of the talk that, you know, we did this for gamification. And this is picture here is exactly how we incorporated some of that into our offering at Paper, where we wanted to track and encourage additional activities on the platform by giving challenges, trophies, and circles. These services down here in the bottom left represent new services we created to track progress against those things, progress against trophies, progress against circles, without having to change any of the code that we had in our core offering. For our offering around tutoring, for essay review, for others, we didn't have to modify any of those. And we were able to roll out these new capabilities with select groups and measure the impact of them. One of the great things about this model too, as we built these new services, we had zero risk of impacting the core offering. If we introduced defects or bugs, or if one of those services went down, it did not impact our core offering at all. It all worked as normal. And then those services we could correct offline, bring them back up, and it was smooth. So this is really where we have gone from our architecture. One thing I would say, just kind of as anyone's making this journey, we have a principle that we follow in engineering. We talk about a lot of progress over perfection. As you're doing this, it's always going to be imperfect. Those that are on the technical architecture side are always going to be pushing for the perfect thing there. It's always tempting. But really, to do this, there are so many steps along the way. You have to be thinking about, 4 steps away, but willing to live with imperfections as you go. As someone on our team says, good today is better than great tomorrow. Getting something out there needs to be done. So that is it. Wrap up questions. I think I went a little bit quick, Sheila. I'm 20 minutes in, but.
No worries. Anyone want to talk on the chat or ask questions? We have quite a couple of folks here.
Come on, somebody has a question.
Yeah. Otherwise, my one was basically when you were talking about the third parties tracking, right? So what were the trade-offs there? Like you mentioned like leveraging these other tools. Did it make sense? Why did it make sense on, not developing your own structure and so on? And when would it make sense to develop your own structure instead of just taking the third party variation of it?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's if the third party gives you 90% of what you need, it's really better to go that route. When we were looking at it, there's always a few things we're like, all right, we could do it better if we build ourselves, but that cost was going to be significantly higher. And so really is it meeting a large percentage of our needs? And really in that space for client side events, the space is so mature that it's going to meet 99% of what you need. So that's really it, but it's definitely a temptation. You know, our team really, as we started down this, was like, oh, we should just, you know, send a message from our client to our server to fire an event, because we had started using that for other things. We had to step back and say, no, look, there's other tools that are optimized for it.
Got it.
So, Brian, I'm curious, what were some of the cultural challenges you ran into at getting this architecture adopted?
Great question, Sam. The biggest thing is really going from this to this, because it was new to the developers to be thinking about this. And it was new to our product managers to be thinking about it. So ultimately, they were the ones that were building capabilities. And then we had another function, which is, all right, we need better data. And that was always secondary to building the feature. For example, if we were going to add new audio capability, it was very tempting for the team working on it, the product manager and the developer, to say, I'm very focused on that. The data and the events will come later. And so that was what really took work. And the way that we solved this is we incorporated it into our SDLC, and we brought in members from the business to work with a product manager and pair. So in advance, we knew what questions we wanted to be able to answer. And that was really the key, is to get it at the planning phase versus once development had started. Because once development had started, it was very tough to go back and say, oh, now you need to think about publishing these events.
Excellent.
We have a question from Tiago here. So how can you implement the feature flags without generating maintenance issues?
Largely, that's just a matter of hygiene and feature flag hygiene, making sure that once features are generally available and you've rolled them out to the entire customer base or user base, that you're going back and cleaning up and removing them. Absolutely, if you do not, it becomes a maintenance overhead. So that's something else that really is incorporated into the SDLC. So we have part of our process where squads are periodically going in and doing feature flag hygiene, is effectively what we call it.
I have one. Launch Darkly looks like it play an important role on allowing you to test features on the services you start to create. What was the process to choose this platform over others we have on the market?
So that one was predated me. We had actually used that as part of our software development process. But I will say that we have been happy with its capabilities, largely because it is good in allowing us to slice different groups that we want to both do testing with and to bring to CA and GA across a lot of different dimensions. Within EdTech, very often we're looking at enabling things for specific schools or specific districts, but also within that, we will want to be able to have various different control groups within there. And so it makes it easy to define the parameters of how you slice that.
Got it. And it would be okay to create a feature flag there and use it on more than one service, right?
You know, we have not done that. So I don't know, we haven't hit challenges with that. I would be careful thinking about that, because you may start to see confusion around what service or what team owns a flag. And then who owns, going back to the hygiene piece, who owns the responsibility of cleaning up starts to become blurred.
I see. Okay, thank you.
What else? Rodrigo, you've got to have something.
I'm shy.
Yeah, I would say folks are a little bit quiet. Oh, Hugo, come on. You're from, you're from the house. You can say directly, not just the chat. Come on. Well, anyway, Hugo is just showing his appreciation for the content, which was very, very rich. Anybody else? Otherwise, I'll wrap it up.
Nice to see you, Brian. Sam again.
Always
Long
good to see
time,
you.
man.
There we go.
Yeah.
Oh, perfect. Then Ryan, I really appreciate you sharing your time. We know you have like this crazy schedule and all these things to do, but I think this was very rich content, not just for the folks here, but also for those who will check out this on YouTube or LinkedIn later on. It's always, it's much better when somebody's talking from experience and, sharing a little bit of the hurdles that you had. So I was really happy that somebody asked about, the cultural change as well. So that was really, really interesting on, how you can bring this in. I don't know if you have any other things that you'd like to add. Sometimes if like how you were harnessing trust from the folks, not just, within product engineering, but the rest of the organization to make this change. This is always a big investment of effort mainly. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing I'd say I highlighted before too, but it definitely takes time, both from the technology side and from the culture side. It takes a lot of iteration. You're going to be taking a lot of baby steps as you go, and just be prepared for that. And, part of the shift towards service oriented is making sure that the various teams owning on different services feel that accountability and sense of ownership, and sense of pride in what they're working on. And so really, as you're bringing this data piece into it, making them feel ownership, not like it's just something they have to do for someone else. That's really one of the key things on the data piece.
That's something that we end up telling candidates as well, like, or even our internal team, because when they're building and facing these challenges, this is of course really good for the company, but this is also good for them career-wise, right? Because this is something that they're incorporating that, and that kind of, makes them more valuable when they're going to have facing these challenges further down the line again.
Yep, absolutely. Being in a model where you're exposed to the data is more and more important in most industries these days. Really 10 years ago, I think people didn't have the same sense of BI focus across the business. And today there's much more of a need for the business to have access to it. There's a whole lot more data science and analysis that's done on the data. And so having that skill set's huge. So it's a big part of people that we're hiring here, and I think everywhere.
I have one last question, if I may.
Yeah, of course.
Well, you have web UI and mobile app there, and how do you handle, like, you have 4 services, and well, web UI needs to communicate with the 4 services. Are you guys using something like a BFF, or maybe the monolithic service turn it into something else to allow this communication? Because I mean, it will be very unproductive to be aware of the 4 services on the web UI or on the mobile app, right?
So right now, the way that we have this set up is they're all routed through the same domain, but path-based routing to the different services. So it's effectively at our load balancer, we're able to route to appropriate there. We don't have an API gateway in place right now. That's something that we may at some point. But right now we're just relying on load balancer within GCP.
Huh, got it. Thanks for clarifying.
Yep, great question.
Okay, then I guess we're good. And then Ryan, again, thank you very, very much. I know sometimes people come up with questions afterwards, but if we do, then I'm happy to, everyone can just write to Ubiminds at Ubiminds, and I'm happy to pass them along. And that's it. Hope to meet you guys soon again. We will be back next week with some conversations about how to pick companies that make sense for you to have a meaningful job with, what will resonate with you. And then after that, we're having some other guests in the upcoming months. So we're having folks from Giphy, from LaunchStarter, from Litera. So lots of good companies and good folks showing up over the next editions. Okay, thank you everybody for your time and have a good one.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.